We're here so that our voices can be heard. That's what we want. We're going to hear today why our voices should be heard. We have behind us our elders, if you wish, our men with knowledge, the same as the ordinary people, had exactly the same. So today we're going to listen, learn and live on the Northern Beaches. So I wish you well this afternoon, and on behalf of my ancestors, I welcome you to this incredible part of the country. Welcome.
Why this forum? I was away for about 6.5 years, and when I got back, I felt that there was something very wrong. Something had happened that was different. And I realized that the community there was a lot of anger in the community about the amalgamation. The sudden development, overdevelopment, and all the cliffs faces being devoured, the tree canopies being eradicated, DAs getting through that break every rule, the constant mantra from council on have your say, and then ignoring us, wasting our time, and nothing changing. What I've realised is that Pittwater has been overpowered and forced into a super council deliberately structured to eliminate Pittwater representation. We've become political prisoners to the Northern Beaches Council. So I'm hoping that by coming together and inviting key speakers who have a vision and passion to the area, can share with us ideas and give some insight and guidelines on how we can respond to this mammoth problem facing us now, because we have reached the point of no return.
The heritage study that we did 1988-1989 looked at Pittwater as the succession of Pittwater from Warringah, and it was fairly unusual in that there was a particular request for the identification of or the rethinking of a scenic line which had been drawn around Pittwater by one previous study, and it was just a line. So I was asked to look at that, and that's what I'm more or less talking about today, trying to get to that point, that instead of a line, we've determined an area of significance as part of the heritage study, and it's quite unusual. And for the last 43 years I've been working in heritage right across Australia, and I've done a lot of heritage studies for different places, and I've never come across that request. There was also a request to look at the impact of coastal processes because of offshore sewerage issues. This was last century, so things have changed and some other things haven't changed. I've got a series of images. This first image up is a diagram that I've drawn over 6 maps, which points out that there's actually the Northern Beaches Council area has 6 different components to it. And the number 1 is Pittwater to the north. There's some numbers there, but they're a bit faint on the imagery. And I've defined them by catchments. So we have Pittwater, which involves the Lambert Peninsula and the Barrenjoey Peninsula, and part of the sandstone plateau, dissected sandstone plateau to the south and Bayview, and Scotland Island and in the middle. And I've been a resident of Scotland Island for 51 years, so I've got to know the place reasonably well. And the other areas, the second area I've got is the sort of central complex of sandstone plateau and freshwater drainage coming down into lagoons and swamps, freshwater swamps, and then beaches and headlands. And then the third one is what I call the Manly complex, which is borrowing not only the Tasman Sea but also parts of Sydney Harbour. And then I've got the fourth one is the Middle Harbour estuary, and the fifth one is the Cowang Waters estuary, and the sixth one is the Tasman Sea itself. But what's really important about Pittwater is the fact that we've got the biggest estuarine water body out of all of those, what I call those 6 components. And it is spatially contained. This was just a part of the study was, and I really don't have enough time to go through the methodology of the study, but part of the study was to identify, from my point of view, landscape types. And you can see this very clearly on the aerial photograph. You can see the urban and suburban areas, and you can see the vegetated areas. And in comparison, let's say for the Lambert Peninsula, which is green and grey-green, and then you have, you can see Brookvale and Dee Why and bits of Mona Vale coming up as very urbanised, white, pathological spots on the map. So it's easy to kind of map that out. Next one, thanks, John. So it's a lot about mapping and seeing things. And then part of the heritage study is to look at the history of things, and so this is the very earliest mapping of the northern beaches by Major Mitchell, 1834, and he identifies the landform reasonably accurately and identifies the wetlands and the alluvial areas and the sandy areas joining the remnant geology, the weather geology. In the early 19th century, they didn't draw contours on maps, they just had shading. So it's quite interesting. And then this next map is from Griffith Taylor, Professor Griffith Taylor in 1958. And he saw it as a series of islands, which were the weather geology of the Narrabeen and the Hawkesbury, joined together by sand and alluvium. And in those areas you get the lagoons and the wetlands and the beaches. And the headlands he saw as the islands. So you've got Barrenjoey, Longreef and North Head. And he's extending that further. So it's a way of looking at the structure of the whole of the place, and how does Pittwater fit into that? And Pittwater, I think, is very special. And so we come to Pittwater, which an image sent to us, I think to Rick and myself by a good friend, Rod Simpson. And this is, for me, this is Pittwater. You've got the Lambert Peninsula on one side, which is Bargee National Park, and that's a very visionary statement. And on the other side, we have the Barrenjoey Peninsula, which this is, a sales brochure, but it's an interesting three-dimensional view from above. It's not quite accurate when you get into the detail, but it's the nature of the forces of the real estate mentality that we're in. And part of the heritage study is looking at what I call the mark made by the European mind, so that the idea of grants of land and subdivisions, which has resulted in much of the suburban environment we know, roads, and there's a whole history of this. You don't need to see the detail here, but these are the parish maps, which identify the very first grants and then how they've been broken up into smaller parcels and how they've got to where we are today. And so I was looking at this in 1988, and it's got even more, deteriorated today. Thanks to. It's hard to see that, but you're not meant to see it really. Also, historic imagery is always evocative, and Pittwater was known as the lake, in contrast to the sea. And so you get this wonderful, wonderful sense of contrast between the open ocean, the Barrenjoey Peninsula, and the Lambert Peninsula, and then the waters of Pittwater. This is, and not so many boats in 1899. It could have been Richard rowing back to Lover Bay. But the other aspect of the peninsula, of the Barrenjoey Peninsula, is this is a view from Bushrangers Hill, looking south, and you get the pattern of the residual headlands, the beach embayments, and you can just see a little bit of the basin of Mona Vale with its wetlands coming in. Very extensive wetlands and lagoons, all now filled in, of course. So, and I think it was Governor Phillip who first climbed Bushranger Hill and looked down and described the environment and how marvellous it was. And you can't see very clearly here, but there were large areas of burnt bushland, obviously managed by indigenous cultures. So there was much clearing and burning. And so they falsely thought that it's good for sheep. Thanks, John. So there is this process of going through the history and understanding the history in order to come up with something that's of heritage significance. And in that journey, in 1894, we have the vision, and there's very few visionaries involved here. And this is the vision of Eccleston Dufar, the surveyor from the Lands Department, who fought for the establishment of Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park. And the Ku-ring-gai is his white man's dreaming of an Aboriginal place. And it's been, I'm really pleased that National Parks has now agreed to remove the name because it's a fake name. But there are many people, including Indigenous people, who would fight for the fact that it's real. And I've been besieged, I've made this very public, I've been besieged by the Gurungi people north of Newcastle who have validated that. Anyway, I don't want to get into that argument, it's a long discussion. But the vision to conserve nature, the beauty of nature, and the scenic wonders of Pittwater was one of the visions of Eccleston Dufar. He was also instrumental in establishing reserves in other parts of New South Wales. And it's a great shame that, to me, that he didn't go far enough to take the national park right into the Barrenjoey Peninsula and up to Barrenjoey itself. Because I think that's one of the answers to our conservation of this place, in that we could live as people do in the Lakes District in England. You can live in a nationally significant landscape and environment and still have development and residential development and so forth. It's a matter of how we do that. But there's a kind of a divide here, that one's national park and the other's freehold real estate. And this is just a drawing of mine from last century, from my veranda on Scotland Island. And you see the water plane of Pittwater is a very important element. So and then the landform. So the two things that become very important in terms of the heritage is the water body itself and the landform. And the fact that you frame the views through trees, through the forest or the woodland. And that the trees are disappearing, the boats are increasing. I think at some point we'll not see water when you're down at the water level, you'll just see masts and yachts and whatever. And I've been guilty of that, I've got a mooring. That's the kind of visual structure that I was interested in looking at, to understand and to respond to the naturalness of the place. And this is the cover of the study. There's 4 volumes. and there were 4 of us who worked on it. Again, there's more historic photographs on the western shores overlooking Ventnor and Rocky Point between what is now Alvina Bay and Lovat Bay, Scotland Island, and then the peninsula in the background. And this is the 1880s, and there's orchards and so forth, there's rural activities, and there's boats, and there's all sorts of other activities, but there's a semblance, you can still understand, you can still read the naturalness that's evident in the place, and that is what's eroding away very slowly. And things, in landscape terms, that erosion is very subtle for a lot of people. They don't realise that it's gone until it's actually gone. You know, you can get accustomed to change and not understand what's happening to you. I just wanted to say that we use historic images to try and understand what it was like, what it is like now, and how could it be in the future in terms of what sort of planning, design and planning implementations can be put to conserve some of these things. And the conservation is not purely for nature, it's also for cultural aspects. It's for Indigenous culture, and it's for European culture, and hopefully Australian culture, all coalesced together. The net result of this was a lot of mapping, and this is the most significant map, I think, because it's the area of significant visibility. So the area that's hatched in, and I realise you can't read it very clearly from the floor, but it doesn't really matter, but the area that's hatched in, the diagonal hatching, that I see as the most significant area to be conserved. And I would think that this could be a conservation area, and it doesn't matter whether it's residential, European-orientated landscape, or whether it's a national park, in that the sense of naturalness should pervade the whole place and the qualities of it. So this was presented with recommendations, and I've got copies of the recommendations here. There were 28 recommendations for the conservation of this area, as well as other things that we identified. And it's not exclusive to Pittwater itself, so it goes out onto the headlands and onto the coastal section of the peninsula, the Barrenjoey Peninsula. But we were only limited in our study to kind of Mona Vale Road, coming down Foley's Hill and into Mona Vale. So, and it's done for the succession of Pittwater from Warringah, and so there was a kind of rubbery edge to it. But I was suggesting that everything in that shaded area will be subject to a DCP, which will be lodged in an LEP, and nothing ever happened. Warringah, no. Pittwater, no. Northern Beaches, no. And so it's timely to come and revisit this thing and revise it, revamp it, bring it up to date, and understand it better, because I'm suggesting that, in fact, I arrived at this from looking at viewpoints from public spaces, from the water, from the ocean, from roads, and from lookout places where people would come and see the landscape. And so it's a landscape area, and it comprises very much the slopes. And some of the things were about conserving tree canopy, responding to the different ecologies of wet gullies to dry slopes to wet slopes, to different aspects, and then to different elevations, and then waterfront character, not to fill in the bays, not to straighten everything, to keep that informal curvaceous edge to the line of the water body. And there are many recommendations, but the other one was also to build, any buildings would be subservient to the landscape. This is a nice woodcut block done in 1925 by a friend of my father-in-law, who's also an artist. And this is my house on Scotland Island in 1925 with no other houses around. and it is now much more suburban than that. And how wonderful for us to have this balance of conservation between the human things and then the natural things. So that's a plea for being concerned about these things.
Much appreciated. It's on our mind constantly around here. All right, our next speaker is Richard Leplacier, one of Australia's most influential and internationally awarded architects. Richard likes to be described as a practicing architect who for decades has been living on the wild side of Pittwater, and he's always keen to exchange ideas and concerns with the community. Thank you, Richard.
Neil, thank you so much for the country. My little family and I live on the wild side of Pittwater in a very simple little house that belongs in the landscape of the place, and scarcely a day goes past without our thinking about that amazing culture that has gone before us, and a lot of whose knowledge has been lost, and it's just with great respect that we think about them. So thank you very much for that. That's a brilliant heritage study that Craig has just informed us, of which Craig has just informed us. It's very rare that you will see something done with such sensibility and such connection to a place. And it's not surprising that the bureaucracies have taken no damn notice of it whatsoever. And I think it is high time that we collectively did something about it, which is why today. So, Anne-Marie, thank you very much for setting this up. 50, 60 years, more than that, nearly 70 years I've sailed on Pittwater. So over that sort of time you start to get your sense of the pulse of the place, like in all its weather systems and its calmness and its ferocity. It is, as we all know and love, the most amazing place. It has an ethos about it. It has an atmosphere about it. What are those things that give it those sorts of qualities? And Craig has described some of them very clearly. Can I put it to you in a very simple way, that somebody has come to you with a Persian carpet, and it is worn out in the middle from the footsteps of time and families. And this person has come to you with your expertise and said, can you please repair this carpet for me? It belongs to our family. Well, the first thing that one has to do, as you would appreciate, is you have to find the weft and you have to find the weft and the woof of that carpet. The strands, the structural strands which are laid down in different colours, through which all the patterns are woven. If you don't find that first structure of it, whatever you do with that carpet will not be long. Be long. To be for a long time. What we're talking about today is about belonging in this place. And so I just want to start from not so far back, because our first Australians have been here for a long, long time. They have understood this place brilliantly, and the lessons we all hope are starting to come through to us now. But if I could go back say 16,000 years, when the ice caps were starting to melt, and places which we know today like Sydney Harbour and our Pittwater were actually valleys, treed, with streams running through them, because the great ocean seacoast was 10 miles out to sea at the edge of the continental shelf. And that slope from the cliff faces that still exist now, that slope out to the edge of the continental shelf was the great eastern plain of this country. And on that plain were all the original inhabitations of the sea saltwater people. And from the time that the ice caps started to melt and the waters started to rise, and they rose something like 200 to 250 feet, from that time onwards, Pittwater slowly started to come into being as the rivers that were there and the creeks that were there were flooded and the water levels rose 200 feet. So we have the technology today to look at the underwater contours of Pittwater and see where all those rivers ran. We can see where the undersea mounts are. We can see where the great holes or deep parts of it are. And when you start to know Pittwater well, you start to ask questions of the place. For example, why are the pit deeps off Portuguese Beach and that amazing strong headland, why are they there? Because even when Pittwater was rivers and forest, that, I think, would have been a small lake which would have had great significance, I feel. So the first thing that one has to do is to look at the underwater terrain. Once the sea level's in there, you can't see anything, out of sight, out of mind. And when you see that, you start to realise that the points of ingress into Pittwater of the water systems and the catchment that Craig has so brilliantly shown us are absolutely important. So, Pittwater, if you look at it as a great water room, has three sides, four actually to the north, but just three basic sides. One side, the so-called cultured side. I say so-called. The side that Craig showed us with all the development on it, all the way to Barrenjoey, almost. It has the other side, which I always call the wild side. So we have nature, the wild side, and we have so-called culture, the cultured side. Then we have, of course, the north-facing Bayview side, which is undergoing such change at the moment through home units being built, that if they keep on going in the way that we are with that, and I don't say we collectively, I mean councils, then Bayview will change unbelievably. The trees will go, and it'll be more like the eastern suburbs and Vaucluse where you can barely see a tree. That's what's going to happen. So that has to be discussed. Density will change because we get more people, but there are ways of doing it well, and there are many ways of doing it badly. So if you then get up to 50,000 feet and look down on Sydney, we have the city of Sydney and Sydney Harbour. We have to the south the Royal National Park and Wollongong. We have to the west the Blue Mountains National Park and the mountain towns. And we have to the north Newcastle and the great national park on the wild side of Pittwater. Sydney will become a coalescence of Newcastle to Wollongong. There's no way that we will stop that. As soon as they put a fast rail in, it is on. So what happens? is that we have three brilliant buffer zones: the Royal Blue Mountains and the wild side of Pittwater. So, rule number one, the wild side of Pittwater has to have a whole set of special conditions about it.
Yeah.
The first one is that those places which have been put aside for housing must have a set of rules that makes us make those houses small, not big. We don't need a lot to live in this country, especially with our climate here. You can make small houses really beautiful to live in. The danger is that money comes in, and if there's no rulings about this, these more monstrosities are going to go up, which we've seen happen on the culture side really strongly. And that ethos, that atmosphere of the wild side will in great measure be lost. If you look at Pittwater as a whole, it has a whole series of points that come out. I'll just name them quickly. Stokes Point, edge of Carril Bay and Palm Beach. Taylor's Point, Clareville, with its wonderful public forecourt to the water and the houses tucked back, good decision. Green Point, which was the most wonderful, like a duck's bill shape, went out fine edges, Crystal Bay, Newport. Green Point, Royal Prince Alfred Yacht Club, started as a boat shed, now is this anonymous, glazed in monstrosity, I think, and it destroyed that point of land completely. And I'm a sailor. I've sailed out of there, but it is not a good imposition on that point. Church Point, wonderful Church Point where many of us live. Do you know that my friend Karen and my partner, we were doing some research about Church Point. And I said, oh, why don't you go to the archives office in the city and see if you can find some of the first maps and drawings. She did, and she found one, 1820 Whitefellas map, done by a surveyor, and in immaculate copperplate writing, written across Church Point with the words, Warra Warra. You check on that, and it means go away. He thought it meant that's the name of the place. Right. But what that also says is that Church Point is a take-off point to all the other sides of Pittwater. It's a landing place, it always has been. Forever and a day. Way back. When the sea levels rose, Scotland Island became an island. Before they rose, you could walk across to Scotland Island. It's a shallow zone, you can see it on the underwater terrain. So these are the sorts of things that one has to do in order to be able to come to grips with how you make change that belongs. Now, if you look at this side over here, the so-called cultured side, there are shifts there now that are getting many of us really anxious. More people are going to come to live. Okay. How do you make denser housing that can have gardens within it, that can allow for expansions and intergenerational housing so that grandparents, parents and kids can have their simple little lives going on in there? Because it can be done. And we have the minds in this country to do it. Why is that not being really seriously thought about? And then if you think about the chain of beaches between Manly and wonderful Barrenjoey, you realise that all the little townships that have gathered about those beaches all had different backgrounds. Brookvale, my God, Brookvale, Brookie. The Valley of the Brooks is what it means. And that's what it was. And if you look at Pittwater Road, it goes right round the back of Brookvale because you couldn't get across the middle of Brookvale because of all the wetlands and the drainage systems. And they smashed the road through, filled it all in, and it's gone. is it in part retrievable, is the question to ask for the people who are set up to do this. Golco, Pulkai, the golf course, that wonderful golf course with those screens of trees that lead up to the Manly Lagoon. Thank heavens that that's there, even though you might sort of poo-poo the game of golf, but you may not too. I mean, those sorts of great green areas that have been left should not be interfered with. Motorvale, right outside here, the park, which has buildings in there now, but a lot of it left, was a water body, wetland. That shouldn't be grass. That should be the most beautiful pond that sits in there, where people can sit by the edge of it, sail in their model yachts, kids can paddle in some parts of it, but that's what belongs there. And at some stage, it went through to the sea, I feel. I remember where the industrial area of Mona Vale is now. I remember when that belonged to Sir Edward Hallstrom, and he used to grow all his grasses, and there were albino kangaroos there, and those grasses all went to the zoo, and it was suggested to the council at that stage that that land should be taken over and used as parkland that connects Mona Vale, aka Chirimeta, that was its original name. That Chirimeta should go back to its beautiful connection to Pittwater, because all the water bodies here and down there where the industrial areas drain to Pittwater. You don't put industry in places that drain to a beautiful place like Pittwater. And if you do, then you have to go over those drainage systems, reconstruct them, take out the concrete edges to it, make planted systems, hold the water back in a whole series of small dams that can then have fingers that go out into other areas and other uses. They're the base movements that have to be made. Lots of things to talk about. Those salient points on Pittwater that I mentioned, Woody Point, Longnose Point on the wild side, Soldiers Point, Church Point, they are precious because, as Craig's beautiful images showed, they come out like fingers on my hand, and you can see the perspective of distance as the receding headlands disappear into the haze. Never to be built on, really. There are some houses on some of those salients which are just okay. There's a couple of houses on there that, if they are taken over and poorly built on, rebuilt, Woody Point, for example, which is a symbol to all of us on the western side, would be decimated. So those salient points have to be totally protected. Housing over there has to be made small and respectful, recyclable, so that materials used can be reused again. And so the story goes on. It's a complicated but actually simple set of conditions. So I would just like to put that to you as a concerned group, and to say to you as well, and to finish up, and I'm sure that you all feel this way, I personally don't like dealing with councils, but I would rather deal with the Pittwater Council than I would a Northern Beaches Council. And that the smaller and the more local government is, the more chance we've got of belonging. Thank you.
My next speaker is Angus Gordon. A lot of you probably remember him. He's a coastal management and environment engineer, a past director of Pittwater Environmental Foundation, and the former general manager of Pittwater Council, a very well-known yachtsman in the area and a proud Pittwater resident for 50 years. Angus Gordon.
ladies and gentlemen. Interestingly enough, I'm the engineer here surrounded entirely by architects. It's supposedly a very dangerous thing to do. Nearly as dangerous as putting your hand up to be general manager of a council. It's interesting because Rick and I actually used to race against one another, I think, in the early 1960s. And so we do go back a long way. And he talked a lot about the mapping, the underwater mapping, and of course that's exactly the work that I was doing before I became general manager of the council. I'm not quite sure why I put my hand up for that, but I'll work it out one day, or somebody will tell me. What I wanted to do today was to just take you through a few things that I was taught and I learned as general manager of the council about planning. Because up until then, really, as I say, I was a coastal engineer, and I don't think I really had much of an understanding about planning. The key thing here is that planning should start with visions and outcomes, not formula. And that's one of the problems we have now. LEPs and DCPs are formula. They're process documents to deliver the vision, not to create them. And that's a really important thing to realise. The state government decided that they didn't even like the way everybody was putting their LEPs and DCPs together because they were they represented too much what the locals needed. And so they introduced the standard instruments. Again, a formula, not a vision, and that sort of pulled apart some of the really good work that had been done in Pittwater with the LEPs. What they do is because they miss that first vital step of looking at visions and outcomes, they drive repeatable mediocrity. In other words, it's sort of the what you might call the McDonald's of planning. And the reason they do it is actually just simply to make it easier for developers and the state government. That's really, if you get into it, that's what you find out. For me, and the thing that I learned, and it's following on from the previous two speakers, really, is that the old Pittwater LGA was a string of villages and settlements, each with its own culture and sense of place, which is a very important thing, and I think was reinforced particularly by what Rick was saying. And really, the vision I had when I thought about it as I started to get into the planning was it's a series of valleys and watersheds and offshore communities, all sharing a common thread of environment and community. But it is all these little interconnected villages. So if you're going to have a vision to move forward, and I would say that that's, as I'm saying, that's the place to start here, then the vision should start with things like buildings nestled in trees, frogs and water dragons in creeks, birds and possums in trees, even maybe koala, and a lot more, but things like that. And in fact, when we were putting the, revising the Pittwater LEP in my time, and when we were doing the LEP for Warringah and Manly, I got quite a few people together, and the planners from the council, but quite a few people from the community, and we went away for a day. And the first thing I did was say, close your eyes. For the next half hour, I want you to think about what it would be like walking through the streets of Warringah Valley in 20 years' time. What would you like to see? And it was quite interesting because at the end of it, we came out with people agreeing what they thought it should look like. And in fact, much of it was achieved right up until the state government stepped in and started to really stuff things up, which they have done terribly. And I must say that I'm not impressed by the planning panel either, and a number of the decisions that they've made. So that this is because, again, we're dealing with instruments, not visions. I would argue that much of the planning is what we might call discretionary. That's whether or not you have small houses or big houses, whether or not you have what distance from the street you place the houses or the water body, maybe even what colour the roofs of the houses are. These are discretionary issues. But as an engineer, one of the things that strikes me is that we don't look at the things that are controlled by nature, the hazards, the natural hazards as they're called. Mind you, they're only hazards if you put things in harm's way. Naturally, they're not hazards. Planning, as well as all the other things we're talking about and will be talked about today, planning should therefore aim to minimise and manage the exposure to natural hazards, not to treat them as if they are discretionary, because they're not. It's an expensive mistake, both financially but also mentally, as you can see what's happening in Lismore and the Hawkesbury is a classic example. The interesting thing in Pittwater that I found, and it really surprised me, was that over 2/3 of the dwellings in Pittwater were affected by one or more of the following: flooding, bushfire, landslip, shoreline erosion, coast and estuary, windstorms and acid sulphide soils. In other words, a massive part of Pittwater, and this goes back to our first speaker, a massive part of it is dependent on the landscape that we live in and the natural hazards that creates. And so it's really important. The funny thing about the planning, and this is driven from the state government planning and the whole thinking behind it, is that the planning simply makes these matters for consideration. Well, let me tell you, we can no longer afford to put people in areas of high risk. And we should see that from what's happening now. But the interesting thing is the federal government had a commission look at what occurred in Queensland in 2011. And it worked out that between the government and private and the insurers, the losses associated with what went on in 2011 were over $30 billion. Now, most of you may not remember this, but you actually had to pay a surcharge on your taxes to pick up that money. Now, what do you think is going to happen now? Where do you think we're heading? It's as I said, we can no longer afford to put people in areas of high risk. So that has to be built into the planning. This is the engineering coming out, mind you, but, you know, again, I've got to be forgiven, really. I've got to defend myself a little bit. Okay, now I'm just going to change tack a little bit. Are amalgamations a good idea? And I'm sorry this is a very busy slide, but, you know, amalgamations came about by this argument of economies of scale. Only problem with that is that dates back to the Industrial Revolution and past centuries. Before computers, you don't need it anymore. It's a silly way of doing things. It really is. With computers, you just do not, that is just not an argument. What the amalgamations do actually is makes it easier for state to manage, because big and clumsy councils are easily managed by the state, and it's easy for the state to take powers away from big clumsy organisations. This goes back to what Rick was saying about smaller councils being actually important. Mind you, I must say that they're very good for consultants. Sometimes I do continue to do some consulting, because large, clumsy organisations generate lots of work. They're also good for some consultants because they can serve on planning panels. And most of the consultants serving on the planning panels also, by the way, just happen to work for developers. That's not a corruption issue, it's just a conflict, I think. They're very good for developers because councillors can no longer interfere with DAs. They can't get involved. And so why have you got a council again? I'm just trying to remember. So what happens to the community is they lose their sense of place. And I've really seen that happening here. The sense of place that used to be that when I was GM of the council, people were so proud of that. We had about 40 different residents' associations. You may think that that was silly. I didn't. I thought that was a really good idea. There were people I could talk to, there were people who could talk to me easily, and they could convey their sense of place, which was quite different. And it was important to be able to understand that. They're also worse for communities because, I don't know whether you've noticed it, but it's pretty hard nowadays to get good access and timely responses, if you get a response at all to anything that you're doing. And of course they are actually worse for local contractors because they have difficulty competing against large non-local firms. And you might think that that's not a big issue. Well, let me tell you what happens is when we have a windstorm or something, or problems that come up with hazards, you try ringing up somebody who's a large contractor, whereas The number of times we had problems and I could just ring up one of the local guys and they'd be straight down and get the things cleared. We had a number of land slips back in the late 1990s, and they occurred at night. I think it was over 20 of them. And I was able to get the contractors out there by 3 o'clock in the morning to start clearing up and saving houses. You try to do that with a big contract, not a chance. And funnily enough, larger councils actually cost more. And no matter what people argue, and one of the reasons for this is because you actually need a bigger management structure. Because you've got to, not only a bigger management structure, but you cannot really allow people the initiative. This is why if the armies just say, follow orders, you can't afford initiative. At the size of Pittwater Council, we had about just over 300 employees, and it didn't take me long to get to know many of them and to understand their limitations and their strengths. And that meant that I was able to give them a lot of delegation, and they gave me a lot of feedback about what they felt could improve the area. The bigger the council gets, the less you can afford to have that type of connection. And that's not just the situation with councils, that's the situation with businesses. And that's why you see so many of the businesses break themselves down into separate business units. It's for that very reason. There's also, of course, the loss of time to access job sites from more centralised locations. That was a fairly big thing from our point of view. And you lose the understanding of the infrastructure systems, and so you lose the capability for rapid response, and there's a lot more than that. The current scorecard, I think, what I'm seeing is, and what I think is important for all of us to focus on, is the lack of vision and understanding of the difference between the LGA areas in the Northern Beaches, let alone within each of one of those areas, but there's a lack of understanding. Manly is very, very different to Belrose. Belrose is very, very different to Newport, Avalon, Scotland Island, and that is lost. We have a problem too with, because as I said, we have this dissociation. The community consultation seems to be aimed more at making people feel that they are being consulted. There seems to be actually little or no notice taken of community views and concerns. I don't know about how many of you, when it says have your say, and you put in submissions. Yeah, I know, I've done it quite a few times. I don't do it anymore because the only person I'm talking to is the hand. The council's got a very, very bad record on that, I must say. There's also a lack of internal knowledge and history, and that's because people have moved on. And there's been a fairly large churn, which means you've lost that understanding. There's obviously overdevelopment occurring with excessive removal of trees, and you can see that all over the place. And of course the roads are fantastic because now they're fit for purpose because most of you own four-wheel drives. Unfortunately, even on the trivial things, leaf litter, clogged trains. Now we live in a very treed area. One of the things I did was to make sure we purchased a number of street sweepers, and we had them running all the time. Not because we wanted the streets to look pretty, we didn't want the leaves to get into the drainage system and further down. And by the way, the leaves, if you pick them up like that, they were very, very reusable to put around trees, etc., and in the parks. It was a very good way of generating fairly cheap material. One of the other issues is there's not a lot of encouragement any longer for working from home. We brought in the late 1990s, I brought in a working from home policy, and by that we were able to retain some really, really good staff, many of whom were women who were having children. And they felt they had to leave because they couldn't really look after the children, particularly babies, but then later on even the kids going to school, they couldn't look after them. Brought in the work from home policy, we stopped losing that talent. And funnily enough, at times used to have to say to some of the people, you better stop, just take a bit of a break, because you're actually working too hard. Working from home is not about getting up at 9, sitting down at a desk and then going through till 5 with maybe a 1 hour lunch break. Working from home, and a sensible employer works out the tasks somebody has to achieve within the time frame and just says, I don't care when you do it, these are the tasks, this is when we need the outcome. And that works, I can tell you, extremely well. One of the things about the council that it's really, really good at, that I'm finding, is lots of PR and spin doctoring. I find they're excellent at that. Far better than we were, by the way. So just finally, the last slide. Of course, I've been jumping up and down about this whole seawall for quite some time now, because it's a disgrace, frankly. As a coastal engineer, it's an embarrassment. It's brutalist engineering, in my view, from the last century. This, I must say, I borrowed this off the social media, and I think it's off. It was off a thing that had been put on by a new federal member. I must admit, I've got probably too many photographs of this, but I just thought this was beautiful, because you see, in the Coastal Act, it actually says that for the life of the structure, you have to have access along the beach. Now, it's only been there a couple of years, and look what you've got. Council's already erecting signs that says, danger, you can't access the beach. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to what's being said here today about the need to ensure that planning comes from vision. It doesn't come from formulas. The formulas, the DCPs and LEPs, are what you have to implement the vision. Don't get it around the wrong way. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. John Illingsworth.
Thank you. I'd just like to say a couple of quick things. We've had some terrific speakers here and some wonderful points of view. I was born here. I grew up with koala bears. The place is changing. I just want to say to you this, we've been done over repeatedly by governments when we lost Pittwater. Pittwater at that stage was maturing into something which was really going in the direction that you people have indicated you want to go. And it was just cut from under us. There's a state election coming up. There's a very good chance that the Liberals will lose power. And Labor, if they do get in, have told us that if we fight for Pittwater, they will help us get it back. So I think the only thing to do, it is political, unavoidably, the only thing to do is to struggle to get Pittwater back. Pittwater had very sensible boundaries, despite what everybody says. Struggle to get Pittwater back, fight, be prepared to pay an extra rate, an extra amount of rates, because you want to live in a special area, it's going to cost extra money to maintain it and protect that precious environment, but we must do it. But you've got to be prepared to do it, and you must tell your neighbours that they must be prepared to do it. And then, if you're ready, if we are ready when the state government falls, we have a chance of getting all this back and bringing all this to fruition.
Thank you, John. You just beat me to it. I was just going to say that nothing will be solved until we take charge of our own area and replace Rob Stokes with someone who will push for demerging from Northern Beaches Council and fix the broken policies of overdevelopment, make all public recreational areas and parks in Pittwater heritage for future and safe keeping, because it's the only way. So we have to be brave. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.